Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Julie Allen.
And I'm Scott McCandless. It is the week of April 24th, and this is your Monday briefing. Both the House and Senate will be in session this week, with committee hearings on FY24 appropriations continuing. The House could vote on proposed legislation that would pair an increase in the debt limit with federal spending cuts and other policy changes. On April 26th, the Ways and Means Social Security Subcommittee will hold a hearing on the history and finances of the Social Security system, and the Oversight Subcommittee will hold a hearing on tax-exempt hospitals. Then on April 27th, the House Ways and Means Full Committee will hold a hearing on the accountability and transparency at the IRS, featuring IRS Commissioner Danny Werfel. Julie?
Thanks, Scott. In addition to busy congressional action, we are seeing a lot of international movement around Pillar 2. Will Morris, our Deputy Global Tax Policy Leader, joins us to discuss the recent developments around Pillar 2 and actions companies should consider taking. Will, thanks for joining us today.
Great to be here, Julie.
So we know that an official from the European Commission was speaking at an April 20th seminar, and they said that at least 5 or 6 of the EU countries are likely to delay their implementation of the Pillar 2 15% global minimum tax. Can you tell us some information about that?
Sure. So this actually it's an interesting point. Cast your mind back to last year when there were a number of holdouts against Pillar 2, which required unanimity in the EU. Some of those were very small countries, which didn't have a huge number of headquartered companies which were over the 750 million euro limit. So what they wanted was an exemption from themselves having to impose the minimum tax rules to start off with. And eventually they got an exemption for 6 years if they had 12 or less, I think 12 or less of these large companies. What that means is, they don't have to pass these laws, they don't have to administer them against their own companies. However, what it does not mean, and this is very important, is that companies in those countries are out of the minimum tax regime. That is actually not the way it works. So if there are companies in those countries who are owned further up a chain inside the EU, they will still be subject to the income inclusion rule, which is to say that the income will be taxed somewhere else. And interestingly, also, if they're headquartered in those countries, so even those small number of companies, they can be subject to the UTPR, it turns out, the undertaxed now profit rule, actually in 2024. The general implementation date for the UTPR is 2025, but they can actually be imposed in relation to these companies in these countries in 2024. So while this is helpful administratively for the countries involved, it doesn't affect the taxation actually at all.
Well, we've been dealing with the OECD quite a bit, obviously, but now some other international institutions may be getting involved. For instance, the G24 has asked the UN to look at international tax from the perspective of developing countries. Where do you see this going with an expanded playing field?
Well, so this is, as I say, a developing story. So there was a meeting in New York at the end of last month, the end of March, where the UN got together. There was both a tax committee, but there was also a committee of the UN, ECOSOC, I think it's called, to consider this call by the UN Secretary General to upgrade the UN tax committee into an intergovernmental committee, which would give it greater status as it relates to model treaties, and things like that. Obviously, and we know this is not a huge surprise, there has been some disappointment by developing countries from across the globe at the way the inclusive framework has developed. We've seen from the African Tax Administration Forum, for example, ATAF, that they're not completely happy with some of the outcomes. They don't think that Pillar 1 gives developing countries very much, that Pillar 2 is very complex, and there are also other concerns. So what we see, and the G24 is an interesting grouping of larger developing countries, but this process seems to be being led, in particular, apparently, by India and also by Colombia. And Colombia is interesting because their finance minister has also called a meeting of regional ministers to be held in Colombia in the summer, also to discuss these issues. So what we see is a potential fragmentation. Just to be very clear, that may not be very good news. Regardless of how you view the outcome of the OECD project, to have what are potentially a number of separate tax standard setting organizations is going to make things more complex. Nevertheless, that's where we find ourselves. That's the world we're in. So I think this needs to be watched. There will be further work on the UN coming in September, and throughout the rest of the year. And we'll just have to see how it develops. But, people should be paying close attention to this.
So, Will, I'm going to continue with the points you mentioned about the OECD there. So, we know the OECD is coming out with the multilateral convention.
Right.
We know that DSTs are on the rise in the background. And we know that we have the inconsistent implementation of Pillar 2. Can you put all of that together for us and tell us what we should be thinking?
I'll try to. Just as an aside, I've been reading recently a series of books by an author called Pat Barker on the Trojan Wars. And one of the figures that I'm most drawn to is Cassandra, the daughter of Priam, who has the gift of prophecy, of seeing the future. She also, unfortunately, has a disadvantage of never being believed. And then when what she says comes true, she's always blamed for it. Now, I'm not saying I have any of those, but I know the feeling sometimes. So with the multilateral convention, we do expect to see this in probably July. There's a G20 finance ministers meeting, which is expected to in some way approve it. There are, however, some interesting questions about that, because we know at this point for a certainty that at least in the near future, the US Senate is unlikely to ratify it. What does that mean for other countries signing it? Indeed, there are rumors that the US will sign it or the US won't sign it. Either way, if the Senate doesn't ratify this, then already a number of finance ministers, including the French finance minister a month or two ago, essentially have said, this will be the US's fault if it doesn't happen. Okay. So that's an unfortunate situation, not just for the US government, but also for US business. But that leads into the DST thing, because then this apparently gives permission for more DSTs to tax the income which Pillar 1 isn't officially going to tax. As you know, the Treasury negotiated a standstill on DSTs, new DSTs, a year or two ago, but that expires on January 1, 2024. And already a number of countries are talking about what they will do if there isn't an OECD agreement on Pillar 1 after the beginning of January 24. So we're likely to see more of this. And there is the danger that these become more expansive than they were before. And then, yes, with Pillar 2, we see a lot of countries beginning to implement this. But there are inconsistencies. For example, there is Korea, which has said it'll bring in the UTPR in 2024. I understand that there is a relatively decent chance that that will change. But we see different countries using different language. The UK uses different terms, for example, in some of their things. So as we look at Pillar 2, there are going to be, potentially these inconsistencies. What can businesses do? Well, prepare at the moment is the answer. I mean, we talked about this many times before. Understand your data, understand the numbers, that type of stuff, but also keep a very close watch on this, because Pillar 2 is happening. It will definitely happen, and companies need to be prepared for that and to try to understand the nuances. Pillar 1 and the DSTs, that won't affect everybody. But nevertheless, if you look at the impact of Pillar 1 on transfer pricing, on some of the other tax treaty things around lowering the threshold on nexus, for example, permanent establishments, this is still, in the end, going to affect everybody. So while I understand that this is not great news, that it is difficult to get your arms around, it is also really important because this is going to be, essentially both sides of this, the template for international tax going forward.
Well, thank you. I think your insight on the delay of some of these countries on the implementation of Pillar 2, on the international tax reform, and then really overlaying the multilateral convention, DSTs, and with that delay of Pillar 2 has been very insightful. Thank you for joining us today and for sharing that.
You're very welcome. Cassandra, though I may be.
Be sure to check out the latest Week in Review with Pam Olson, included in the description of this episode. Also, stay tuned for this Friday's Week in Review.
And as always, thank you for spending this time with us. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.